We're talking Ohio State football, and we're going position by position, courtesy Pat Murphy, Bucknuts, 247 Sports. Get on over there, check out Pat's work. And we appreciate Pat stopping by as he does on a regular basis to talk Ohio State football with us. Defense, let's go to the defensive line, Pat. And I always think about the guys on the outside because they can have the kind of games that JT Tuimoloau, although that was a career kind of effort. And I actually went back just in the last week and kind of breezed through that game and was reminded how devastating and how just ridiculous that performance was that he delivered in Happy Valley. But that's why he was the number one player in the country coming out of high school. And then Jack Sawyer, of course, another 5-star. And, you know, we all get our attention grabbed by those guys that can come off the edge and wreak havoc and strip sack and create big plays. But let's start on the outside or on the inside, because that's where you have to be stout. And your thoughts about Mike Hall and the rest of this group that is going to be counted upon to be the heart and soul of the defense.
I think there's a lot of potential with this group. And you start with Mike Hall Jr., who, when he was healthy last year, looked like one of the more dominant interior defensive linemen in the country. You mentioned JT Tuimoloau in the game he had against Penn State. Well, Michael Hall, I think against Michigan State, played like 7 or 8 snaps and had like 3.5 tackles for a loss as an interior defensive lineman. So this is a guy who's a disruptor for sure. Really a guy that they've been kind of waiting for at Ohio State for some time. He just needs to stay healthy. And even in the month or so that they had between the Michigan game and the Georgia game, we heard he was going to have a bigger role in the Georgia game. Still didn't play a ton. So hopefully this offseason allows him to get back, get healthy. Tyleik Williams, Ty Hamilton, 2 other names to know in those positions. Both played well last year, but really an opportunity to step up into bigger roles as well. They added Tywone Malone out of the transfer portal, an Ole Miss transfer who Ohio State recruited out of high school pretty heavily, but was interested in playing baseball as well as football at the college level. Did so at Ole Miss. Won a national championship, though he didn't play a ton with the Ole Miss baseball team. Now has decided football's his path. He's a guy who already, if you kind of see the pictures Ohio State's put out, seems to, with a full focus on football, seems to have already kind of developed into more looking like what you'd expect from a defensive tackle than a guy that's also playing baseball. Listed on the Ohio State roster at 6'4", 305, so a good frame already. So you've got a nice mix. I'll throw Jaden McKenzie's name in there, Hiro Kanu, the sophomore, as guys that could potentially be a part of that rotation. But if I were betting on kind of that 4-man rotation that Larry Johnson likes, it would be Mike Hall, Ty Hamilton, Tyleik Williams, and probably Tywone Malone as those 4. And I think you're pretty happy with that group if you're Ohio State.
Now we get to the outside. I've already brought up 2 names. Your thoughts about, again, guys that are counted upon to deliver as 5-stars, and we've seen flashes, especially from JTT, who's on most preseason All-America lists, and Jack Sawyer maybe cut loose a little bit more and not have to play that jack position.
To me, for the defensive ends, it's about consistency. And you mentioned that Penn State game. That shows you the ceiling for JT Tuimoloau, right? Well, you're not going to get that every game. It's just impossible to do what he did in that game. And I would read you the stats from it, but that would take us the rest of the podcast because it was just so insane. But you need him to consistently play closer to that level than kind of the floor that he's sometimes played at. And he's been good for Ohio State. But as you mentioned, one of the top players in the country coming out, every school in the country would have liked to have him on the roster. Jack Sawyer, similar. He played that jack role last year as a sophomore, kind of the hybrid linebacker, defensive end, standing up, moving around. It didn't work. And whether Ohio State uses the jack position or not, we'll see. Jim Knowles has said he would like it to be a part of the defense, but he doesn't see it as necessary as maybe it was at other stops. But Jack Sawyer, as of this spring, back to playing defensive end. I think that's going to help quite a bit. You're going to have a guy on the opposite side, JT Tuimoloau, who's going to be able to rush the passer at the same level, and you got to try and stop both of them, right? And because Larry Johnson likes to rotate, I will mention Caden Curry, a guy who flashed early last season, Kenyatta Jackson, both sophomores. Kenyatta Jackson had a really good spring. I think both have high potential and could see their roles significantly increase as kind of the 3 and 4 in kind of the rotation there. Another one of their classmates, Amoya Bohr, that was pretty highly recruited, has yet to kind of break into that rotation, played some last year kind of in that garbage time, but he's a talented player who could also maybe find himself a role. So certainly plenty of depth there. It's just a matter of kind of where Larry Johnson sees that cutoff line in terms of the guys he's going to play on a regular basis. But I think when it comes down to it, the two we mentioned off the top, JT Tuimoloau, Jack Sawyer, those are the guys who you expect to kind of be your bread and butter on the edge this year.
And as we move to the linebackers, that's been a sore spot for the Ohio State defense. But I thought they got more production, better play out of those two than what we've seen since probably Raekwon McMillan's crew in 2016 in that range. Steele Chambers, you got to credit him for what he's been able to do in learning the position coming over as a running back. And of course, Tommy Eichenberg had an exceptional year.
The step up in play from the linebackers was probably the most impressive thing, maybe on Ohio State's whole roster, certainly the defense last year. And give Jim Knowles a lot of credit. He is the linebackers coach, so to speak. It's not in his title, but that's the position he coaches in addition to being the defensive coordinator. They brought in James Laurinaitis, obviously the All-American, all-everything linebacker at Ohio State, who spent last year coaching at Notre Dame. Now, technically, he is a graduate assistant, but for a lack of a better term, he's going to coach linebackers this year for Ohio State until they are allowed to have more coaches, full-time coaches on the roster. I think that's going to be a big boost to this position that, as you mentioned, Mark, already played pretty well last year. James Laurinaitis just not only has been there and done that, but the way he teaches it, and we've seen it in talking to him, and then this summer at recruiting camps, he just gets how to work with these guys. And so I think that's going to be a help. But look, you've got your two returning starters in the two you mentioned, and Tommy Eichenberg, who should be on All-American lists as well going into the season. Steele Chambers, I will be interested to see that position, and maybe if there's a bit more rotation there with a CJ Hicks potentially, the sophomore who, five-star kid last year, didn't play a snap on defense, but they've already talked this offseason about making a bigger or creating a bigger role for him. So does that mean getting Steele Chambers out a little bit more? And even maybe Tommy Eichenberg at times. Tommy played a lot of snaps last year, and at the end of the season was playing with casts on both his hands. He was banged up a little bit. So maybe you rotate that position a little bit more, get some other guys in there when you can, just to keep guys healthy, as well as getting some guys snaps. But like I said, at the defensive end position, I think those are your two guys when the chips are down, so to speak, that will be in there. And they showed plenty last year for Buckeye fans to have confidence about that position.
Now, on the flip side, the disappointment was the cornerback play. A lot of that, though, had to do, of course, with injuries and there not being the type of depth there from a quality standpoint than what we're used to. But also the top end play is not what we're used to either, from a position that's famous for being a high point in Ohio State football. But Denzel Burke is obviously the leader out there as it stands right now.
Yeah, Denzel Burke, you mentioned the injuries. He missed 2 games. You look at the kind of snap counts for the position groups. Denzel Burke led cornerbacks with 582 snaps. Tommy Eichenberg played 761. So, that shows you what you kind of missed with the guy that had some injuries and whatnot. Look, I think when Denzel Burke is healthy, he can be one of the top cornerbacks in the country. I think he can play at the level of what Ohio State refers to as BIA, best in America. The Marshawn Lattimores, the Denzel Wards, those guys. He has that ability. It was just about health last year and being on the field. And he's admitted that's kind of dealing with serious injuries, not serious injuries, but more serious injuries than he had before, mess with his head a little bit, trying to recover and not being able to practice and his routine and all that. So I think if he's back to full health, and I think you saw it in the Georgia game where he was about as good as he'd been all season, I think you've got that position. Then you look on the other side of the field. Jordan Hancock was a guy they were really excited about coming into the season, suffered an injury in preseason. He didn't end up playing until midway through the season, and then missed another 2 games, didn't play against Georgia. So, and again, health needs to be healthy there. They added Davis Igbinosun, another Ole Miss transfer, who physically is the most daunting looking cornerback on the roster. He's at 6'2", just clearly head and shoulders above some of these other guys. Not that you need to be the biggest guy, but I think it certainly helps. He's got long arms. He and Jordan Hancock, in my mind, are the two that are going to contend and maybe even rotate at that second corner position opposite Denzel Burke. You lose J.K. Johnson to the transfer portal, Cameron Brown out of eligibility, but you did have some other guys, Jair Brown, Ryan Turner, who played a little bit, that got some experience. But to me, those are kind of the big three: Denzel Burke, Jordan Hancock, Davis Igbinosun. And look, I think that if you look back in Ohio State history, at least on paper, and recent Ohio State history, I should say, that's about as good as you're going to get in terms of skill level and whatnot. Now, you got to put it together. You got to produce on Saturdays. But I think there's room for belief that this will be a much better unit, again, given health.
And then we'll go to safety, where Jahad Carter's another key pickup through the transfer portal coming in from Syracuse, kind of taking that Tanner McAllister role, set us up at the safety position.
I think it's going to be interesting to see how this all plays out in terms of who is where in this group, because there's quite a bit of talent. So how do you get these guys all in the field? You got Lathan Ransom, who last year kind of played the boundary safety position. You've got Sonny Styles, who's a guy who everyone is very excited about, similar to CJ Hicks. Didn't play a ton last year, but certainly athletically, one of the bigger guys on the team. Where I think he's outside of the linemen. I think he's one of the biggest. I think he is the biggest guy if you kind of combine both height and weight on the team, and athletically can just fly. So how do you fit him in? Josh Proctor's back. He's a guy who was supposed to start early. You do lose Ronnie Hickman, but you've got other guys in there. You mentioned Jahad Carter. Cameron Martinez was the one taking the first team reps when we were there in spring at that kind of nickel position. But they think Jahad Carter could potentially play some of the other safety spots as well. He's a bigger body than Tanner McAllister. So you've got quite the list of potential players at safety. Kai Stokes, a young guy who has flashed a little bit. I still think probably a year or so away. Court Williams is a guy who's been in the program now for a while, but has battled injuries and has never really been able to make an impact. So where do you fit these guys? Is this a position, or these positions that you kind of play based on matchup, as opposed to having three guys that are on the field most of the time? Jim Knowles seemed to be a bit more open to that idea than he was a year ago. And I think that just has to do with talent and numbers. So I think it's going to be very interesting to see, kind of where guys are lining up, fall camp, start of the season, and then maybe how that changes throughout the year, like I said, based on matchup and how guys are coming along.
All right. And we'll finish up, Pat, with the spot that sometimes gets ignored or passed over, and that's just special teams, whether that's coverage, whether that's return units. And if you just look at, obviously, the rule changes in college football over the last 5+ years, you see that those units are not nearly as important, just because there's not as much play. We won't go through the rules, but if you understand the rule changes, then you know that there's not as many kickoff and punt returns as there once was in college football. But all you have to do is look at the Michigan game, and maybe the play that is blamed as being the turning point, or the possible turning point that could have been in a positive direction, of course, was not a physical error, but a misplay by the special teams and the coaching. And then, of course, the play that ended the season was a missed field goal. So special teams, mighty important.
For sure. And you notice them more when they don't work, like you're saying, right? Then when the easily makeable field goal goes in, or the punt gets off. Kicking wise, Noah Ruggles, who, as you mentioned, missed that field goal, that 50-yard field goal, as we counted down to 2023 on New Year's Eve. Parker Lewis, Jaden Fielding are the two guys that are going to contend, really. They also brought in Casey Magyar out of the transfer portal from Kent State. I assume it will be mostly Jaden Fielding who does most of the kicking, but that there is some competition there. Punter, Jesse Mirko's the guy. He's the only punter listed on their roster right now, though I imagine they will have, another guy or two can do it. they actually went to the transfer portal to get a long snapper, despite actually having one who played a good amount last year. John Froman, who came from Arizona State, he is, I think, for sure going to step in as the starter at that position, which not a position we think about a lot, even less than we think about punting and kicking. But again, if you don't have a long snapper who gets the ball consistently back to the punter or the holder, you can have some issues. So they do like John Froman a lot. He's got some experience already playing at Arizona State. He'll be in at that position.
Pat, we appreciate this. This is kind of a yearly deal where we bring Pat in, get us all set for fall camp. And now you got your personnel breakdown, everyone. You can thank Pat for that and check him out and his work on bucknuts.com, of course, 247 Sports. Pat, it should be interesting, but of course, there's a lot of work to be done by the coaching staff before we reach week 1.
Yep, absolutely. We'll be covering it all, and I'm sure you and I will have more of these conversations before the season gets underway.
Thanks, Pat.